In November of 1881, in Wyoming Territory's Wind River Range, the year's inaugural snowfall occurred early and was substantial. By mid-October, homesteaders, residing along the Popo-Agi River, were already splitting wood at a frenzied speed, racing against time. Everyone was aware of the fundamental rule. To survive a Wyoming winter, a minimum of 4 cords was necessary, possibly 5 if the season became exceptionally severe. Yet a particular issue, seldom discussed publicly in town, persisted, one that extinguished fires and nullified labor, and caused families to shiver in the dark, despite having wood stacked ceiling high. This was damp firewood, which one could split until their hands were raw. One could arrange it neatly and compactly beneath every available overhang, but once November's rain transitioned into sleet and snow began to pile up, to a depth of 3 feet, subsequently melting during a Chinook wind, or when February delivered its characteristic heavy, wet snow that saturated tarps and canvas as though they provided no barrier whatsoever. Your wood would inevitably get wet, and damp wood fails to burn. It merely smokes, hisses, and absorbs warmth instead of radiating it. The majority of men simply resign themselves, thinking, such is winter, such are the mountains. You chop more, you burn more, you simply bear it. Yet a single individual did not accept this fate. Everard Ashford was his name, and in the autumn of 1881, he excavated a cavity beneath his residence, leading the entire valley to. Conclude he had lost his sanity. Prior to continuing, if you are watching this, kindly do me a favor. Click the like button and subscribe. As every week on this channel, I deliver authentic survival strategies from the American frontier, methods, which genuinely proved effective when comfort was not an option, but survival itself. And please, leave a comment informing me of your viewing location. I am eager to learn if you are presently struggling with damp firewood, or if you have developed your own techniques for preserving its dryness. Now let's delve into what Everett constructed and why its functionality was doubted by everyone. Everett Ashford was not a brilliant mind, nor was he an engineer. He was a carpenter originating from Pennsylvania who had traveled west in '78 alongside his wife Margaret and their 2 young children. He erected a robust cabin on an elevation overlooking the river, complete with a strong foundation, secure shingling, and a stone fireplace. Measured by frontier criteria, it was a commendable residence. Nevertheless, Everett encountered a persistent difficulty each winter that vexed him. His firewood storage was chaotic, mirroring that of others. He arranged his wood on the cabin's northern flank under a sloping lean-to roof, with tarpaulins placed over it and held down by stones. This arrangement functioned adequately in arid, cold weather. However, Wyoming does not offer dry cold. Rather, it presents freeze-thaw patterns and rainfall that transforms into ice. This results in snow that thaws under the afternoon sun, then solidifies again overnight, transforming your wood stack into one solid, icy, waterlogged block. For half of his winter mornings, Everett would use a splitting maul to separate congealed logs, attempting to locate sections sufficiently dry to ignite. Even after successfully starting a fire, the damp timber would smother it with vapor and creosote, leading to a blocked chimney. His household inhaled smoke, and the calculations were harsh. Damp wood combusts at roughly 60% efficiency compared to dry, which implied he was consuming nearly double the quantity to achieve an equivalent amount of warmth. During the summer of 1881, Everett reached a conclusion that perplexed those living nearby. He intended to excavate a root cellar, not for produce, but specifically for storing firewood, positioning it not adjacent to the dwelling, nor behind it, but directly underneath. His intention was to dig out a space situated immediately below his cabin's primary living area, with access provided by a concealed door in the kitchen's flooring. Featuring an additional exterior entry point on the lower slope for timber delivery, the subterranean area would maintain its dryness. It would be steady and shielded from the elements. Any dampness would be drawn away from the structure by gravity, and the ground itself would shield the timber from repeated freezing and thawing. For Everett, this was entirely logical. To all others, it seemed utterly preposterous. "You intend to excavate beneath your own home's foundation?" inquired his neighbor Jacob Pruitt, while standing in Everett's garden that July. Observing him delineate the measurements using stakes and twine, Everett clarified, not directly beneath the foundation, adding, "It will be offset by 2 feet. The cellar's walls will not make contact with the dwelling's supports." Jacob gestured negatively with his head, stating, "You are inviting either a structural failure, a deluge, or possibly both." Margaret Ashford remained largely silent. However, Everett discerned the apprehension in her gaze. Nevertheless, she placed her confidence in him, as he had constructed the cabin properly on its initial attempt. He would repair the flue if it developed fissures, possessing expertise with masonry and lumber. By the close of August, Everett found himself submerged to his waist in the soil beneath his residence. He was extracting pails of clay and stone, reinforcing the sides with cleaved timber, and establishing a layer of gravel at the base to facilitate water runoff. The excavated space extended approximately 8 feet in width, 12 feet in length, and reached a height of 6 feet at its midpoint, providing ample capacity for 3 cords of cut timber. The wood would be arranged tidily and readily reachable. News of this spread throughout the entire valley, and everyone there concluded that Everard Ashford had lost his mind. Let us discuss the actual construction undertaken by Everard, as the structural design here demonstrates greater ingenuity than is immediately apparent. The subterranean timber storage was not merely an excavation. Instead, it constituted a meticulously engineered thermal and water management system that leveraged 3 fundamental concepts. To achieve stable subsurface temperature, gravity drainage, and vapor pressure equilibrium, Everett first excavated about 5 feet beneath the cabin's floor. This positioned the chamber's foundation roughly 7 feet beneath the ground surface on the elevated side. He selected a location where the natural slope of the land descended away from the dwelling, guaranteeing that any moisture entering the setup would drain downwards and away from the building. Instead of bare earth, the chamber's base consisted of a 6-inch layer of coarse gravel placed atop compressed clay. This design mimicked a French drain, allowing water to seep downwards through the gravel and then travel horizontally towards the outside entry point, from which it emptied into a shallow trench leading away from the property. This prevented any stagnant water or mud. There was no dampness seeping back into the firewood stack. The walls comprised dry stacked fieldstone for the bottom section and split logs for the top portion. Every part was filled with clay and small rocks to ensure stability. Everett intentionally left spaces between the higher logs. These served as ventilation openings, each no more than 2 inches wide, situated on opposing walls to facilitate air movement while keeping out precipitation. The crucial element was the chamber's link to the house. Everett fashioned a trapdoor in the kitchen's flooring. Measuring approximately 3 feet square, it was positioned directly over the wood storage area. He reinforced it with double joists and attached a hinged cover, insulated with wool remnants. When shut, it was almost hermetically sealed. When opened, one could descend a ladder to retrieve an armful of firewood. This allowed access without needing to go outdoors. However, he continued his work. On the chamber's lower side, he excavated a sloping tunnel, 4 feet in height. It was just broad enough for a person to stoop and walk through, exiting the house about 15 feet distant. This served as the loading entry point during autumn. During the fall, Everett was able to split timber in the yard, transport it via the tunnel, and store it below ground, avoiding bringing mud or snow into his kitchen. A small wooden door at the tunnel's opening prevented animals from entering and blocked accumulating snow. The design was remarkably simple, yet effective. Beneath the surface, temperatures remain exceptionally consistent, even during the coldest parts of winter. The ground beneath the frost line maintains a temperature range of 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This is sufficiently cool to inhibit decay and fungal growth. Yet it's warm enough to prevent the wood from solidifying due to freezing. Crucially, the subterranean humidity levels stay consistently low, provided effective drainage and air circulation are in place. Damp firewood doesn't solely become wet from precipitation, it also draws moisture from the surrounding atmosphere. Consequently, wood kept in moist cellars or under outdoor coverings invariably becomes waterlogged. However, this was not the case within Everett's chamber. The chamber's gravel base facilitated the drainage of liquid water. Simultaneously, its ventilation openings permitted the egress of water vapor, and the earthen walls absorbed the surrounding moisture. This arrangement created an ideal microclimate for maintaining the dryness of split timber. even as the external environment was inundated by melting snow. By early September of 1881, Everett had completed the chamber. He dedicated the remainder of that month to splitting and stacking wood, so that by the arrival of the first severe frost in October, he had amassed 2.5 cords of wood beneath the ground, readily available at any hour, day or night, without exposure to the elements. His neighbors observed this, expressing their skepticism with headshakes. They anticipated the entire endeavor would prove unsuccessful. Daniel Calhoun was the individual whose counsel was sought regarding construction matters. Within the Wind River Valley, having resided there since '74, he had constructed half of the dwellings lining the Popo Aggie, possessing an intimate understanding of stone and timber, much like others are familiar with sacred texts. Towards the end of September, Calhoun paid a visit to Everett's property to personally examine the subterranean refuge. At the mouth of the external tunnel, he stood with his arms folded and jaw clenched, remaining utterly silent for an entire minute. Eventually, he addressed him, saying, "Ashford, I have witnessed individuals attempt ingenious feats previously. The majority of such endeavors conclude unfavorably." Everett cleaned his hands on his pants. "It's structurally sound, Daniel. The drainage system functions, and the walls are firm." "For the time being," Calhoun remarked, "just await the spring thaw. All that accumulated snow atop your dwelling will convert into liquid, and it will inevitably locate the most vulnerable spot in the earth, which will undoubtedly be your excavation. What then of the gravel layer? That will be inconsequential when 200 gallons per hour attempts to permeate frozen soil. It will accumulate and then infiltrate. Subsequently, your entire cellar will transform into a quagmire. You will forfeit the timber, and should misfortune strike, you could lose your home if the earth moves." Everett maintained a composed tone, asserting, "The incline diverts it. I have conducted tests." Calhoun's facial expression remained unaltered. "Your testing occurred during the summer, not beneath 3 feet of snow with frozen earth, and a thaw occurring more rapidly than the soil can absorb it." By October, word traveled swiftly. The tale of Everett's subterranean storage facility had evolved into a sort of ongoing jest throughout the valley. At the trading post, men smirked whenever his name arose, while women would shake their heads, uttering remarks such as, "Poor Margaret. She's wedded to a man who excavates beneath his own residence." Jacob Pruitt was unequivocal, stating, "You are going to inundate your foundation, Everett. Should that occur, do not approach me to request my lumber for reconstruction." Not even Margaret's sister, who was visiting from Lander, took her aside one night and inquired, "Is he mentally sound?" Margaret offered no reply. That evening, she simply observed Everett, who was by the fire, drawing drainage angles in a notebook illuminated by candlelight, and she wished his plans would succeed. The disapproval wasn't merely doubt, it stemmed from genuine experience, as these were individuals who had witnessed homesteads collapse due to lesser issues. A compromise foundation might determine whether a dwelling endured for 2 decades or deteriorated into disrepair within half that time. Water posed a threat to every building on the frontier, yet Everett was intentionally creating an empty space directly under his residence. He was confident the earth would not fail him. Daniel Calhoun articulated it perfectly while standing outside the General Store on a chilly late October afternoon. "Ashford's risk isn't concerning his fuel, but rather his family's dwelling. Such a risk is not undertaken by a prudent individual," and no one disagreed. Winter approached, and soon all would discover who had been correct. The initial snowfall of November 1881 was fine and light. It was swept from the rooftop by strong winds and did not linger. Everett chopped several additional cords of wood and arranged them via the tunnel's opening, thus filling the subterranean compartment almost to its top. By mid-November, his task was complete. 3 cords, completely dry, lay in the darkness below his kitchen. Subsequently, December arrived and temperatures plummeted rapidly. By the second week, morning minimums were nearing 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The Popo Aggie River began to freeze at its banks, then entirely across. Snow descended in successions, 8 inches one evening, 12 the following, succeeded by a short period of melting that transformed everything into a semi-liquid state before the frigid conditions solidified it once more. This particular freeze-thaw pattern was feared by every homesteader. The phenomenon commenced on December 18th, when a warm Chinook breeze descended from the peaks, elevating temperatures into the upper 30-degree range. The previously dry and fine snow became saturated and dense. It adhered to all surfaces. Roofs strained beneath the burden, tarpaulins drooped, and each wood stack throughout the valley began to soak up moisture akin to a sponge. As night fell, the wind direction changed and frigid Arctic air returned. By dawn, temperatures had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, causing the damp snow to solidify completely. Jacob Pruitt's firewood, arranged beneath a canvas shelter on the northern aspect of his dwelling, transformed into one solid block of ice. He dedicated an hour using a maul and a pry bar, merely to dislodge sufficient logs for his morning blaze. Half of these were too damp to ignite, while the remaining half produced dense, suffocating smoke. Fumes that drove his spouse and offspring coughing onto the veranda until the flue was clear. Daniel Calhoun's situation was slightly improved. He had protected his wood piles with oiled tarpaulins, securing them with rocks, yet even his most arid logs felt moist. He consumed an entire cord of wood in 3 weeks, double his usual consumption, as damp timber simply fails to generate warmth as effectively as seasoned wood. Throughout the entire valley, an identical scenario unfolded, blazes that ought to have endured. For 6 hours, extinguished in 3, flues choked with creosote. Men chopped timber in the frigid temperatures, only to discover the core of the logs moist from prolonged outdoor exposure. Women heated water on cook stoves that struggled to maintain a flicker. Kids wore their coats to bed as the dwelling never achieved sufficient warmth. Then, the ultimate challenge arrived on January 9th, 1882. A tempest descended, one that residents recounted 2 decades afterward. Snow fell continuously for 4 consecutive days. 3 feet of snow accumulated within the initial 72 hours. Snowdrifts reached 8 feet against the northern cabin walls. The wind was unyielding, tearing coverings from firewood stacks, dispersing kindling and burying all beneath a white, oppressive shroud. When the blizzard eventually subsided, the mercury plunged to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Residents incinerated furnishings, consumed fence posts, and ignited anything combustible, due to their fuel wood being either buried, frozen solid, or completely saturated. Everett Ashford unlatched the access panel in his kitchen's flooring, descended the steps, and retrieved an armful of cut pine. It was completely arid. The subterranean compartment had maintained a consistent temperature of 48 degrees Fahrenheit throughout. No snow had penetrated, nor had any dampness accumulated. The air vents permitted air movement while preventing the ingress of moisture. The pebbled ground had wicked away the minimal condensation that arose when warmer air encountered the cool ground. Everett ignited his hearth with just 1 match. It ignited instantly, burned cleanly, and sustained itself for 8 hours. Margaret stood by the cooktop, warming her hands, uttering no sound, yet she gazed at her spouse with a look akin to reverence. Outside, the valley was enduring hardship. Inside the Ashford residence, it was cozy, and nearby residents began to observe. If you're still viewing, remain with me. For the subsequent events not only validated Everett's approach, but also transformed how dwellings were constructed in that valley for the following 5 decades. Please tap the like button and leave a comment sharing the most frigid winter you've experienced. I'll meet you in the subsequent segment around late January 1882. The stark difference was undeniable. Jacob Pruitt had consumed 4.5 cords of timber within a 2-month period. Daniel Calhoun had used almost 4, and the majority of households in the valley were conserving their dwindling provisions. They were desperately splitting unseasoned timber, attempting to ignite a flame using tinder and rags saturated with pitch. Everett Ashford had only consumed 1.25 cords. Consider that for a moment. Same valley, identical weather, and homes of comparable dimensions. However, Everett utilized under 1/3 of the timber his neighbors were burning. The explanation was straightforward. It was efficiency. When damp wood is combusted, you're not merely losing warmth to the smoke, you're expending energy. This energy is used to evaporate the water before the timber can even begin to burn. A log with a 25% moisture level, a common state for most outdoor stacked wood following December's freeze-thaw cycles, demands approximately 1,100 BTUs per pound. This energy is solely for expelling the water. It's heat that ought to be warming your dwelling, but it's instead vanishing as steam through the flue. Everett's timber, kept below ground in consistent temperatures and minimal humidity, had an average moisture content of about 12%. That's almost kiln-dried. When he placed a log into his stove, it ignited quickly, burned intensely, and generated virtually no creosote. His flue remained clear, and his fire emitted consistent, uniform warmth. He was able to fill the stove before bed and awaken to embers that were still glowing red at sunrise. Meanwhile, his neighbors were rising to cold ashes and having to restart their fires daily. However, it wasn't solely about conserving fuel. The internal house temperature was also a factor. In early February, an itinerant surveyor, William Hendricks, visited both the Ashford and Pruitt residences during the same afternoon. He carried a mercury thermometer, a costly device for weather monitoring back then, and he noted the indoor temperatures. Driven by mere curiosity, he found Jacob Pruitt's cabin, with a robust fire and a stone hearth, measured 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Everett Ashford's dwelling, featuring a modest fire in a comparable fireplace, registered 68 degrees, a full 10 degrees warmer, using less timber. Hendricks shared these measurements at the trading post a few days subsequent, and the tale rapidly disseminated. A 10-degree difference may not seem significant until you're experiencing it firsthand. That's the distinction between slumbering beneath 2 blankets or 4, or having frost materialize on the interior of your windows, or remaining transparent between your water pails, solidifying overnight, or staying in liquid form. And here's the additional point no one had foreseen. Everett's wood reserves continued to expand because the subterranean chamber remained arid and stable. Everett was thus able to keep splitting and storing timber all winter. Most other men were incapable of this, as their outdoor stacks were frozen solid or covered by snow. Yet Everett could labor on a temperate day, split half a cord, and transport it through the tunnel to a storage area, without concern of it becoming waterlogged in the subsequent storm. By March, as his neighbors were, collecting the last of their reserves and eyeing their fence posts, Everett still possessed a cord and a half underground, arid and prepared. Daniel Calhoun witnessed this firsthand. He had stopped by in late February, ostensibly to borrow a saw, but in reality, to ascertain if the subterranean shelter had flooded during the spring thaw. The temperature had risen into the 40s for 3 consecutive days. Snow was thawing everywhere, transforming the ground into a muddy quagmire. Everett unlatched the trapdoor and invited Calhoun to inspect. The chamber was arid. The gravel flooring had absorbed and channeled away the slight seepage. The walls were sturdy, and the wood stack appeared as if it had been arranged just yesterday. No mold, no decay, no dampness. Calhoun remained standing, gazing down into the chamber, and at last uttered the words Everett had been anticipating for months. "Well, I'll be damned." It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. The figures were undeniable. Everett's system functioned, and it performed more effectively than anything else in the valley. Here is the analysis, as accurately as local documentation and verbal histories can piece together. Average wood usage per household. Winter of 1881 to 82, 4.2 cords. Everett Ashford's usage, 1.5 cords. Wood conserved, 64%. Average indoor temperature, February survey, 56 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Ashford's indoor temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature benefit, 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Daily time spent retrieving firewood from outdoor piles, 15 to 25 minutes during severe weather. Ashford's retrieval time, 2 minutes through an indoor trapdoor. Convenience factor, immeasurable, yet substantial. And then came the spring thaw test, the very one Daniel Calhoun had cautioned would devastate everything. It did not. The drainage mechanism operated precisely as intended. Snowmelt seeped through the gravel layer, then descended along the natural incline. Water then departed via the shallow trench Everett had excavated the prior summer, resulting in no inundation, no shifting of foundations, and no harm to the structure. The subterranean timber shelter successfully endured its initial winter, and its performance exceeded mere survival. It demonstrated that what appears to be a wild concept is sometimes simply an innovation no one else possessed the bravery to attempt. The spring of 1882 ushered in a period of questioning. Individuals began appearing at Everett's residence, requesting to view the subterranean compartment, not for the purpose of criticism on this occasion, but rather to gain knowledge. Jacob Pruitt arrived first. He approached one April morning, respectfully, stating, "I'm interested in observing how you constructed that tunnel entry. The specific entrance designed to prevent snow ingress." Everett demonstrated and elucidated the incline, the low-set door, and the method by which he had oriented the aperture to face southeast. This orientation ensured that accumulating snow would drift above it instead of gathering against it. By the month of June, Pruitt had commenced excavating his own chamber. It was smaller than Everett's, measuring 6 by 10 feet, yet constructed upon identical principles: a gravel base, ventilation openings, and downward sloping drainage. Featuring a trapdoor leading into his kitchen and an exterior access point for loading. Daniel Calhoun maintained his resistance for a longer period. Perhaps due to arrogance or simply obstinacy, by the autumn of 1882, he was seeking Everett's counsel regarding foundation adjustments, and also on moisture-resistant barriers. Within a span of 3 years, 17 homestead properties situated within a 50-mile radius of the Popo Aguirre had integrated a variation of Everett's original concept. Not every one of these implementations was identical. Some individuals constructed more basic iterations, merely external root cellars, equipped with effective drainage and proper ventilation, situated in close proximity to the dwelling. Conversely, others fully committed, undertaking extensive excavation. Complete subterranean chambers featuring internal entry. A select few integrated this idea with the storage of root vegetables, thereby fashioning multi-purpose cellars, which maintained both kindling and provisions in a dry state throughout the winter season. However, the underlying principle gained widespread adoption because of its efficacy, and it continued to prove successful. By the 1890s, what became known as the Ashford method, despite not being officially designated as such, had evolved into a customary approach for settlers in elevated freeze-thaw zones throughout Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. Vestiges of these subterranean shelters are still discoverable today, provided one knows where to search. Crumbling stone partitions, overgrown entryways to tunnels, and gravel beds where vegetation struggles to thrive owing to the enduring effectiveness of the drainage system. Even following 140 years, this method not only conserved timber, but also preserved lives for households that managed to keep their fuel wood arid. Burning fewer green logs led to a reduction in creosote, which in turn meant they suffered from fewer respiratory ailments caused by smoke inhalation. This resulted in a decrease in chimney fires. Their residences remained warmer, thereby reducing instances of frostbite and hypothermia. During severe cold spells, children experienced improved sleep, wives were spared from coughing throughout much of the winter, and men avoided overexertion, each morning struggling to separate frozen wood piles. And here lies the more profound insight, relevant whether one lives in 1882 or 2024, the most effective survival. Strategies are not necessarily the most prominent or widely favored. Everett Ashford did not originate the concept of underground storage. Root cellars have been utilized by people for hundreds of years. However, he adapted an established principle to address a novel challenge, demonstrating the courage to proceed even when the self-proclaimed specialist informed him he was mistaken. He refrained from debating them. He didn't expend effort justifying his concept. Instead, he simply constructed it, put it to the test, and allowed the outcomes to speak for themselves. That embodies the frontier spirit, a principle we've overlooked in a society where opinions are abundant, yet fewer individuals are prepared to engage in practical work and demonstrate their claims. Before concluding this segment, if this narrative imparted knowledge to you, if it prompted you to consider differently how our forebears address challenges using only stone, timber, and practical wisdom, please do me a kindness and press that subscribe button. Each week, I present genuine methods from the American frontier, techniques that proved effective in the absence of any contingency plan. See, no hardware store available and no rescue on the way. Also, leave a comment. Which component of this setup would you implement today if constructing off-grid, for instance, the underground access? The gravity drainage or the stable temperature zone? I review each and every comment, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Now, a final point. Educational notice. This video showcases historically influenced recreations intended for instructional and narrative objectives. The characters, names, and particular events are fictitious, whereas the methods, ideas, and tenets explored are grounded in authentic historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any application involving motors ought to be assessed in conformity with current standards, safety guidelines, and pertinent laws or regulations. This material is instructional in character and does not represent professional, technical, or legal counsel.